With the majority of Australian pilots flying in the European theatre, this proved to be a double-edged sword. On the negative side, Australia was devoid of aircraft and pilots, while on the positive side, some of these pilots were serving with distinction and gaining valuable combat experience that would soon be put into action in the defence of their homeland. Australia was confronted with the situation of a possible Japanese invasion. They were bombing our cities and had sunk 40 ships off our coast. With the blitzkrieg entry of the Japanese into the war and their territorial push to the south, for the first time in our history, the Australian continent was under attack. One man who would play a major role in the strategic planning and counterattack to the Japanese invasion was Bill Goering. Bill Goering had already won the DFC, flying Sunderland's in 10 Squadron, English Coastal Command.
At about 9 o'clock in the morning, we suddenly saw 2 Junkers 88s approaching the ship, the intention to sink it. We immediately went straight for it, and although we didn't know the words in those days, the Sunderland was turned into a gunship. It had so many guns firing upwards, eventually 16 machine guns firing upwards. And the Lord Haw-Haw, who was the traitor in Berlin, he said, "Berlin calling, Germany calling," and then he went on to describe an action where the Sunderland had shot down some of their Ju-88s, and he said, "We call it the Fliegende Stückelschwein, the flying porcupine," and that name stuck. And we had 7, all of us, the top Sunderland pilots that went to England to bring them back, we all had over 7 years working with the Royal Australian Navy, and we knew the Navy, how they operated and so forth. And so when we went to England, we took over the Sunderland flying boats as though they were just another ordinary aeroplane. In fact, Hoot Gibson and I went up with a Royal Air Force squadron leader, and we went solo after 58 minutes instruction on a Sunderland. Never been heard of.
That obviously helped too with the arrival back in Australia. You were facing a new enemy.
Well, when Charles Pearce and myself came back to Australia in 1941, we were both sent to the north. Charles Pearce to command the Catalina wing of 11 and 20 squadrons, and myself to construct the first war room in Australia. From there, for the first time, we could control the ships and aeroplanes and so forth in an orderly manner. I flew all over the Southwest Pacific and got to know all of the bases. I got to know the coast watchers, who were so marvelous, really, our great intelligence arm, because without them we would have lost a lot more aeroplanes and pilots. And then I went to Pearl Harbor about 3 or 4 weeks before it was hit by the Japanese. The Japanese were, it was a tremendous force of airplanes, of the most highly skilled Japanese pilots, and they were looking for the American Pacific Fleet, particularly the carriers, and they weren't there. Admiral Halsey was some 60 miles south of his carrier, and he debriefed me for 5 days about the European war. And the carrier force that really wrote off Pearl Harbor was the same carrier force that came to Rabaul. And then it went on to Port Darwin, and from there to Trincomalee. But we had 24 squadron in Darwin, in Rabaul, which was Hudson's and Wirraway behind me. And the Japanese came in and they wrote that squadron off in about 15 minutes, I think. Very brave pilots that took them on, but imagine they had over 100 fighters on their carriers, here against 2 flights of Wirraways and 1 of Hudson's. So that was the first contact, by the way, of Australians, except for Malaya.
LaRue's comment when he was told to attack the fleet the next day after losing most of his flight, he only had 2 Wirraways and a Hudson serviceable.
Correct. That's
was
correct.
Nos Murituri te salutamus.
Yes. We who are about to die salute you. And I'll tell you what, he was right.
Even to the battle-hardened pilots returning from the European theatre, the Japanese were a brutal new enemy. At Rabaul, along with nuns and a priest, 150 soldiers were bayoneted to death by the conquering Japanese in what became known as the Toll Plantation Massacre. To stem the southward push of the invading Japanese, 75 Squadron were rushed north to Papua New Guinea in a valiant last-ditch effort to hold the island.
When they got to New Guinea, John Jackson was the commanding officer, and they serviced them very quickly, and on the same afternoon as they arrived, a Japanese reconnaissance airplane flew over, and they got up and they shot him down, and he didn't get the message to Rabaul and that we had fighters in New Guinea. He didn't get the message. So the following day, Jackson went over the mountains with his 75 Squadron Kitty Hawks, and there were the Japanese that lay all lined up, two rows and one each side of the runway. And they set fire to 12 of them and shot down a couple more, and back to New Guinea, back to Port Moresby. Now that 75 Squadron was alone against the might of the Japanese Air Force, and they lasted for 44 days, until John Jackson himself was the last man to be shot down. And he climbed up against this formation of Japanese bombers, and in the climb, of course, he was at great disadvantage, and the Japanese Zero shot him down. Well, the one aeroplane to come back to Australia at the 44th day was the last Kitty Hawk flown into Horn Island. Now, that then caused great concern, because we had to rapidly rebuild 75 Squadron and 76 Squadron. And we took them off to New Guinea and down to Milne Bay, where we had built a strip. We had the two squadrons there, and the two Australian brigades, one a citizens force one, and the other one that had come back from North Africa. So we had one professional brigade and one that was not so professional, but were brave blokes, and as they turned out to be. Now, the Japs then landed at Milne Bay, but unhappily for them, they landed at the wrong place. A New Guinea, as he was then seaman, gave them the wrong place. They captured him and they made him their navigator. Well, they landed 6 miles to the east of where they intended, and they put their tanks ashore and so on. Now, in that 6 miles, there was a hell of a lot of jungle and rivers and so forth, and the Australians, soldiers then put them. Now, had they landed nearer the strip, they could have captured the strip and caught both of our squadrons, but they didn't. Now, that's a bit like Gallipoli, they landed there. But it was one of the divine interventions, I believe, that caused them to land in the wrong place. And that extra time was allowed our soldiers to get the feeling of them and to eventually destroy them, along with the Kitty Hawks. Now, the Kitty Hawks, they used to take off and climb up to 500 feet, and they'd look for the Japanese on the edge of the beaches and so on, and then fire at them through the air. Milne Bay was strategic. And between Milne Bay and the Kokoda Trail, we stopped the Japanese from getting to Port Moresby. They desperately wanted Port Moresby, and the reason for that was that Port Moresby controlled all shipping straight across due west from Port Moresby. That means right across under Indonesia and right down the east coast of Australia. So no American ships could have got into the north or the east coast of Australia. They had air superiority sufficient to prevent it. So Milne Bay then was so vastly important, and so was the Kokoda.
The Japanese was so close to the strip, they thought that night they might overrun the whole operation and we would lose all our aircraft, pilots and ground crew. Lou Truscott, who was the CO of 76 Squadron, he volunteered to remain with his troops there and, if anything, fight to the death if they did overrun the strips. Fortunately, the cookie crumbled in the right direction, and the outcome was success. Next day we flew back in with the aircraft and continued the operation until such times as the Japanese force was evacuated. Every night we used to get shelled by a Japanese cruiser every night, and I think the whole effort of everybody involved down there was the secret of the success of the operation. With the amount of firing that all the Kitty Hawks did of 75 and 76 Squadron there, it took toll on the armament of the Browning guns, that the rifling on the Brownings, which was kept the bullets going straight, became worn, and so much so that the barrels in turn were useless. So there was no accuracy in the flight of the bullets or anything like that at all. And from then on, it was just a matter of getting supplies. We ran out of ammunition. It was supplied by a Liberator on the USAF to keep us going. And the toil that the pilots, when they weren't flying, was building up ammunition to use on the aircraft as quick as they could. We couldn't keep the ammunition up to the pilots or to the aircraft in that period of time. We did lose some good men there. 76 Squadron lost the CO, Squadron Leader Turnbull, and where Lou Truscott became the commanding officer. And he was a wonderful man in himself, a very respected person and pilot. And he'd come back from England like lots of our replacement pilots from the UK.